Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. For today's seminar, we will open the floor to the questions at the end after the talk lecture. Today's speaker, Dr. Weslynne Ashton, a professor at the Stewart School of Business, with a joint appointment with the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. She co-directs Institute of Design's Food Systems Action Lab, which combines sustainability science and human-centered design with a system focused to develop tools in the framework that can catalyze the transformative work being done by practitioners in the advocacy, advocates to build more sustainable, equitable, and just food systems. She is a sustainable systems scientist, and her research is grounded in industrial ecology and the circular economy. She investigates the adoption of socially and environmentally responsible strategies in business, and the role of innovation in the entrepreneurship in addressing neighborhood scale as well as societal ground challenges. Her current work focuses on increasing sustainability and equity in urban food systems and developing climate resilient and regenerative economies in post-industrial regions in the small island states. She has published scholarly articles on these research areas in top journals such as the Journal of Industrial Ecology, Journal of Cleaner Production and Clean Technologies in the Environmental Policy. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of State, as well as private philanthropy. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a master's degree and doctorate degrees in environmental science from Yale University. It's very exciting to welcome Dr. Weslynne Ashton.
Thank you, Dr. Huang. Thank you all for being here. I know it's Friday afternoon, so whether you're here in person or online, I appreciate your being here. I'd like to start off my talk today by first acknowledging the land that we are on. So our university's contemporary history began in 1940 with the merger of the Armour Institute and Lewis Institute. We have recently embarked on a journey of reflecting on our shared past. This exploration is one rooted in the desire to acknowledge the origins of our physical space and to show gratitude to the original stewards of the land on which we are situated. According to the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian, the name Chicago is commonly accepted as a variant of the word that comes from the Algonquin language, Shikakwa, meaning striped skunk or onion. According to early explorers, the lakes and streams around Chicago were full of wild onions, leeks, and ramps. The land acknowledgement process, therefore, becomes a piece in a larger framework of deeper understanding of Chicago's true history and something we felt encouraged to explore as a university. The Field Museum shares that several original tribes of indigenous peoples lived and thrived on the land that would become to be called Chicago. Illinois Tech recognizes that the land we now reside on, including our Mies, Rice, and Moffett campuses, is the traditional homeland of many Indigenous nations and remains home to diverse Indigenous peoples today. We would like to thank the original stewards of the land that Illinois Tech now calls home, the Miami, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, Peoria, Winnebago, Ho-Chunk, and Kaskaskia. Illinois Tech invites you to join us in this journey of exploring our collective past, to learn from it and better inform our futures. We call on our community to also recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land we inhabit, and to understand our place and impact on the history of Indigenous nations in Chicago. Thank you. All right, so let's get going with this talk. Today, I want to talk about how can we contribute to building a more just, equitable, and circular food systems. So to start us off, does anyone know what this is? Daniel.
I'm lost. I have no idea.
Yeah. So this is a mural drawn on something called a love fridge. So where is there one on campus? In the South Loop, yeah. So these love fridges have sprung up all over the country and across the city. People are invited to take what they need and leave what they can. They are a form of mutual aid, where neighbors help neighbors in times of need. They are an expression of solidarity, not charity, recognizing that at different times, we all need something and we all have something to give. They represent a way that neighbors are recognizing a problem and working to solve it, given the resources available and the system's constraints. I will invite you to consider this question throughout my talk. What if our food system was organized around principles of love, justice, and circularity, rather than money, exploitation, and consumption? Our food system, like most other modern industrial value networks, were built on the premise of a linear economy, that the earth has unlimited resources that we can extract, transport, and convert into useful products and services for society, and that the earth has enough space to absorb the wastes that are generated after we've discarded our products. When we're talking about the food system, of the 241 million tons of food that are produced annually in the United States, 91 million tons, or 38%, are unsold or uneaten, a small fraction of which is currently rescued and donated or recycled. Food waste is generated all across the supply chain. 16 million tons are generated on farms, 13 million tons during manufacturing, 18 million tons during retail, restaurants, and food service, and slightly less than half, about 44 million tons, from households. Produce accounts for 36% of the food that is wasted, and prepared foods, including meals, represent 19%. Wasted food accounts for 6% of our national greenhouse gas emissions, our contribution to climate change. It embodies 22% of freshwater use and 16% of cropland use. So we're wasting the water and the ecological resources that were used to produce these crops that are not being sold and not being eaten. It also accounts for about 1/4 of what goes into our landfills, right? So this is like one of the biggest waste stream that's going into our landfills. Our linear economy is pushing against the limits of our planet's biogeochemical functions. The planetary boundaries framework, which is illustrated here, identifies how human activities are operating within or destabilizing these Earth systems functions. In 6 of the 9 identified boundaries, which include things like climate change and biospheric integrity, we are well into the red high-risk zone, where the activities that we are doing are overwhelming the capacities of these systems to maintain healthy conditions and regenerate the resources that we need. As a result, many are advocating for a new economic model that respects the planetary boundaries. One of these is the circular economy, which has been described as being restorative and regenerative by design. It keeps products, components, and materials at their highest utility and value at all times, requiring less raw materials, relying on more renewable resources, particularly energy, reducing waste at all stages of the value chain, and capturing products at the end of their life cycles for reuse, remanufacturing, recycling of components, and finally, the recovery of energy. A key premise of the circular economy is that we can design our industrial systems to be more efficient, effective, and regenerative. But as is currently being advocated in corporate and government approaches, it is still largely based on traditional capitalist ideals of growth, consumption, and profitability. So I'm sitting in a joint appointment between the business school and design, right? So our business processes are what make the economic model function. And designers also have an important role. So most designers are not trained to understand the ecological implications. Most business students are not trained to understand the ecological implications of their work. And instead, we have the creation, the design, and products of services that are for the linear economy. They focus on a triad of satisfying user desirability, technical feasibility, and financial viability or profitability. To design for people and planet, designers must also consider how their offerings might be sustainable from an environmental perspective, inclusive of diverse people, including not only consumers of diverse backgrounds and abilities who pay for a product, but also those who work to build those products. And a system that's just from a political perspective. So how can the products and services that we're developing promote equity and counter racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression? Designers have a toolkit and perspectives to help shift systems to more just, equitable, and circular systems. These include systems thinking that gives the ability to see how various elements are interconnected in a bigger picture and zoom between micro and macro levels and across different silos. Future visioning opens up visualizations of possible futures, changing stories and narratives to illuminate different perspectives and possibilities. Relational approaches create spaces where people from different backgrounds come together and facilitate collaboration to create a bigger movement. Designers also utilize making and prototyping tools to build conceptual, physical, and digital models early on in the work in order to gain feedback and improve the fidelity of future iterations. There has also been a push for a design to embrace critical theories, questioning the status quo and uncovering how oppressions are perpetuated and thus could be dismantled. And number 2, embracing pluriversalism, the idea that multiple perspectives and futures are necessary and that design should be not for people, but with people. in order to understand the present and the diverse experiences of different people and work with those people to identify the futures that they want and ways to get there. In our Food Systems Action Lab at Illinois Tech, we are extending these perspectives to the circular economy discourse in order to break the conventional, yep, it's supposed to be blank, in order to break conventional wisdom that is still operating within the ideas of profitability, growth, and consumerism. I'd like to share how we are putting some of these ideas into practice through participatory action research. About a year ago, we were approached by a group in the city of Chicago who we had connected with because we were working on a National Science Foundation funded project called Multi-Scale Recipes that's in collaboration with about 20 other universities around the country, where we are examining food waste measurement strategies, prevention strategies. So a very convergent research approach to tackle the very complex food waste problem. So here in the city of Chicago, we were interested in developing a participatory action research process to understand the present challenges of managing food waste in the city of Chicago, understanding what tensions exist between different stakeholders' perspectives, and envisioning alternative futures that challenge the dominant narratives, identifying opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration and pathways for identifying those opportunities. So let's start with understanding the present. I know Hao is a geographer. What do y'all notice about these maps? What jumps out at you? So you see the segregation. Yeah, so our dark colors almost have the opposite concentrations in these two maps. On the left side, right side? Oh, I guess if you're on Zoom, it's on the left side. If you're here in the audience, it's on the right side. The map in blue on the right has food waste generation by community areas. So Chicago has 77 neighborhoods or community areas. My colleague Ning Ai at the University of Illinois at Chicago has estimated that Chicago generates about 451,000 tons of food waste annually, with higher outputs concentrated on the more affluent and more white north side of the city. The Chicago Food Depository has mapped food insecurity and finds higher levels on the lower income and predominantly Black and brown south and southwest sides of the city, right? So these patterns of waste generation and food insecurity follow the geographic segregation that we see in the city. But it's not all bleak. At the same time, right, that all of this food waste is being generated, food insecurity is happening, there are people throughout our communities who are developing local solutions. We see a re-emergence of farmers of color growing food to feed their families and their communities, sharing their learnings with others, and building a food system that's filled with joy and love. Look at these smiling faces here, right? So here's Dulce Morales on her family's farm in the Chicago South Side neighborhood of Englewood, where she, her husband, children, and team grow organic, seasonal produce, and they both sell to customers and provide food freely to community. On this day, she was hosting a volunteer day and meetup for the Community Food Navigator, an organization that I've had the honor to be a part of that is helping to facilitate connections amongst producers and eaters of color in order to build a food system that is rooted in justice and sovereignty, in which the people who produce, distribute, and consume food also control its production, distribution, and governance. So our first step in working with the NRDC, the city of Chicago, in what's called the Food Matters Project, was to facilitate a workshop with about 30 stakeholders from 4 sectors. We had food producers and food service providers, food waste rescue and donation organizations. So in here, we also include community-based organizations, food waste recyclers, folks who are doing composting as well as digestion, and city food waste management. So the city agencies that had responsibility both for policy development and program implementation around waste and food. The purpose was to bring people together for inspiration and networking, with an output of identification of the critical barriers and priorities from each of their distinct perspectives. We then distill these barriers and priorities across the 4 groups. So some of the key barriers that we see are rigid governance. So the rules are pretty strict. They're hard to change. Limited resources, particularly money and land for implementing food waste recycling solutions. And a high variability in food waste flows, right? If there's a large event, we might have a huge spike in food waste. Depending on different conditions, those may or may not be able to be absorbed by the food rescue and donation system. On the priority side, we see the need for a roadmap to develop a vision and a set of tangible pilots that can help us move towards implementing food waste solutions. We then took deep dives with 3 stakeholders representing 3 different places in the food value chain. Urban Canopy, here on the left, is a small for-profit circular food business. It grows and distributes food. It also collects, rescues, and upcycles surplus food and composts food scraps from households and businesses. Seva, on the upper left, is the food service provider at McCormick Place, Chicago's largest conference and event facility with 3 million visitors per year, right? So think about that variability, right? Their food production is really around the time that they are hosting big events, big conventions. And the Chicago Department of Streets and Sanitation, which is responsible for all waste management in the city. We did a number of interviews, shadows, site visits to develop service systems map to help these stakeholders visualize and explain their processes. We then integrated these maps to understand and demonstrate the connections between the stakeholders, helping them to see themselves as part of a larger system and how their actions were helping or impeding the larger system's goals of reducing food waste, rescuing surplus, or recycling food scraps. This map is primarily from the perspective of a food service organization. So it captures how they source and order food, how edible food or ingredients are rescued by a dedicated volunteer-based organization called Fight to Feed that collects uneaten meals and packages them for donation and distribution to nearby pantries. While inedible food, right, so things that we think of as spoiled or meals that cannot be distributed, are sent either to landfills or preferably to be recycled. We use integrated maps to develop insights about current activities and identify new opportunities for collaboration across the different stakeholder perspectives. So around food rescue, we observed a heavy dependence on human labor to handpick and segregate the surplus food items, produce as well as dry goods, into what could be repackaged. Let me do this. Maybe not. Okay. Repackaged or processed and upcycled through freezing or preservation so that they can be used and eaten by people. Items that are not edible by humans could be eaten by animals. And finally, items that are not edible at all go to recycling. Rescuing leftover and prepared food in the upper right requires dedicated space and human labor to repackage or process these items and send unclaimed meals to donation. So policymakers in general are in support of food rescue, but the high labor requirement means that this is very expensive unless you're depending on volunteers, right? And volunteers show up, when they have the time available. And so it's far easier and cheaper for food service companies and producers to discard surplus in landfills than actually get it into food rescue pathways. So we saw opportunities for increasing upcycling by activating more cold storage facilities across the city and incorporating food waste pickup with current waste management activities. So I'm going to pause for a moment and a quick little aside, because something very exciting happened in Chicago this week. So this week, the city of Chicago launched 15 sites around the city where residents can drop off their food scraps free of charge to go into composting. There are 2 sites within 2 miles of campus. So for those of you who are on campus, we have one site that is in the Bronzeville-Kenwood neighborhood. So it's around 44th and Cottage Grove. And one site that's in the South Loop. So it's around 16 and Clark. So it's close to where the Mariano's on 16th Street is located. And so these are really exciting because Project Drawdown, right, one of the global leading thinkers on how we reduce our impact on climate change, says that the 2 most important things that individuals can do to address climate change is reduce their food waste and shift to a more plant-based diet. Right? Now back to our presentation. So on a high level, we see many people who are interested in reducing food waste or developing a more circular food system. But there are important differences and tensions in the values framing these visions. Recognizing and providing a platform to constructively engage in these tensions is needed to drive fundamental shifts in how our systems functions, right? We really have to understand what are the values, what are the things that people care about that will make them work towards food waste. Using narrative analysis and the interviews, we identified 3 dominant socio-technical imaginaries, or articulations of the values and visions of the future that were represented by our project partners and emblematic of the broader group of stakeholders. So we had one group of stakeholders who were very interested in sustainable cities. So they centered their activities around building sustainable and green urban infrastructure that can be developed through citizen engagement and public-private partnerships to incentivize the adoption of sustainable practices all across the food supply chain, as well as support an emerging green industry. We have another cluster, another imaginary that's around strong and sustainable food industry. And this is focused on positive environmental and social impacts of food businesses through a commitment to local and sustainable food production. A big focus in this cluster is around job creation for the residents and promoting socially conscious consumption habits. The third group is a community-led food justice perspective, which centers a radical transformation of our food system with innovative and community-led approaches to fight racism, build economic justice, and social equity by advancing hyperlocal, circular, and culturally appropriate food flows. So these things are not the same, right? So even though we're all talking about food waste, what's important to understand here is how people understand food waste is very different depending on the perspective, the lived experience that they have. So the latter, the food justice, is a radical or a critical vision that questions the status quo and the dominant ways of business-led or government-led solutions. And it demands that citizens and community, particularly those communities that are marginalized, that have been oppressed by the current linear economy, have more of a leadership role in this new food future. So as designers, we prototype tools for helping to shift narratives from the status quo to more desired futures. First, mapping how these shifts were using different types of resources or capital, and identifying what the critical tensions are at play in each dimension. For example, in the cultural and spiritual realm that's highlighted here, we see different core beliefs in how food waste is perceived. So from a food industry perspective, they are beholden to their customers. Like one of the things that they talk about is that the client is king, right? We want the last person in the buffet line to have the exact same experience as the first person in the buffet line, although there's nobody after them to eat a buffet full of food, right? And so this perspective is that we must have the appearance of abundance to make it attractive to consumers. Whereas from the food justice perspective, this excess is seen as an abundance that should be shared. So why should we have all of this abundant food being thrown in a landfill, going to waste? So they have a future vision that's built on a culture of sharing and respect for workers. And so we see a critical tension that needs to be navigated, that needs to be engaged with, is seeing food as a commodity that needs to be sold or as a valuable resource that needs to be shared, right? So this is a really important shift that most of us are not currently engaged in. So we developed a set of cards to guide the conversations at a second in-person workshop, again, with about 30 stakeholders from different perspectives in the food supply chain. So instead of having the stakeholder-specific groupings, right, the food producers, the recyclers, the rescuers separately, we mixed the groups up so that different perspectives were present in each of the small groups. The cards that we developed here on the left describe differences in values that we observed at play, such as the tension in the financial dynamics of having to compete for resources, dollars, donations to support food donation nonprofit organizations, versus cooperation amongst these organizations. On the economics card, seeing the food scraps being seen as a source of value, where we could get the nutrients, jobs could be created, energy and soil. And a difference in cultural values between seeing food as a human right versus as a commodity. Our participants were invited to work together to discuss what these shifts would mean for their individual work, right? So if they're based in a community-based organization, if they're based in a food service organization, what would this shift look like? What would it mean to operate on a more cooperative rather than a more competitive basis with others in the space? So we also discussed how they could put these values into action. These conversations led to several proposals that make space for multiple realities that coexist today and the diverse visions that stakeholders have for the future. So they emphasize opportunities for alternative ways of being and actions that challenge the dominant narratives or status quo that led to food waste being the wicked problem that we face today. I'd like to highlight a couple of the proposals that we developed. So one, up in the center, is investing in decentralized, local, and flexible infrastructure, such as cold storage, that can enable saving surplus produce. So this would recognize the incredible assets that communities are creating and bring much needed investment to activate and elevate their functioning, right? So we see these love fridges being in different places, right? How can we have a love fridge on every corner? How could we have cold storage in places all across the city so that when there is surplus food, usually there's such a limited time window at which that food has to be eaten, otherwise it's no longer safe, right? So it has to be discarded. And so if we have more cold storage facilities, so whether kind of retail things like these fridges, or spaces in kitchens that are shut down, places in grocery stores that we can use for storing some of this surplus food. A second initiative looks at leveraging data for tracking as well as for coordinated action. So there's an important tension here. As data, we know, is easily monetized, right? Like us spending time on social media is being monetized. Somebody's making money off of us. And so the folks who are working in food rescue are very concerned about companies coming in, entrepreneurs coming in and trying to make money off of something that they believe should be a human right, right? So they want to say, yes, we want to be able to have the data and use data to track what's happening to help coordinate our actions, right? So that we, because right now everyone's kind of operating in the dark, right? There's no data management, right? So how food gets rescued from food service providers is that there might be a phone call, right? Some of you may have seen or used an app like Too Good to Go, right? In which a restaurant can say, okay, I have these things that I'm expecting to be left over at the end of the day. So I have 10 items. And so I'm going to put it at a discounted cost where someone can come and purchase that at a much lower price, right? Because it wouldn't have been sold. I would have had to dump it. So that type of data where we are really trying to democratize that data and make it more freely available so people can act on it, rather than being something that a few people are going to make a lot of money off of. We also see an opportunity to enhance knowledge of food production, waste prevention strategies, and enable system-wide leadership, right? So the point that many of our community-based partners, and I would love to just give name to Cosmos Ray, who leads the Bronzeville-Kenwood Mutual Aid organization, who really talks about shifting our food system to be one that's based on love, right? But how can we shift leadership and decision-making so that the people who are facing food insecurity, who are on the front lines of helping their neighbors, have a say in how food rescue happens, in developing solutions. So it's not just consulting with the stakeholders after some product is built, but really engaging with them from early on so that the solutions that we design can meet their needs. So I feel like I raced through my talk, like we are early. So I'm going to end here by saying that food waste is a complex challenge that affects both people and planet. Solutions exist, right? We have new technologies being developed, and that's great. We do need new technologies. We need new data. But many of the solutions are not high tech. Many of us believe that we need to build stronger relationships in communities to recognize when someone is hungry, to be able to share. So we feel that we have to confront the values that are inherent in our linear economy and find creative ways to navigate the tensions of shifting from a capitalist to a post-capitalist system where love and care and human rights are the values that are being protected and honored within that system in order to make space for justice, equity, and circularity in our food system. So just a photo from our second gathering with all of those food system stakeholders working together. Right, and so that I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I would also like to thank the folks in my lab. So all of the beautiful graphics that you saw were created by Azur Sungu, who's a PhD candidate at the Institute of Design. We had a number of students who worked with us this spring on our Design for Climate Leadership course, where we developed many of these tools and did the workshops in partnership with our partners from the city of Chicago, Jen Hurd and Stephanie Katsaros, Carter O'Brien from the Department of Streets and Sanitations, Alex Potoltrak and Joseph Taylor from Urban Canopy, Doug Bradley from SAVA, and Amy DiLorenzo from the US EPA. And I also need to acknowledge that this work was funded by the National Science Foundation through the Multi-Scale Recipes grant. So thank you all for your attention, and I'd love to hear your questions. So do we have some questions in the room?
So, clear the solidarity model, perhaps that's better prospects. I noticed. Then there was certainly a correlation there, but it was actually not as strong as I expected. I was noticing, for example, the road, for example, Roseland, Auburn, Grafton, Boston, South Shore, were all showing pretty high levels of both food insecurity and those. And I'm wondering if perhaps prospects for a program like this are better than those kinds of areas than in areas that have like they're like lowest.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Dan. So there's not kind of like a one-to-one correlation, and I'll just repeat the question for the folks online. So the question was looking at the differences in the geographic distribution of food waste generation and food insecurity, that there are some neighborhoods within the city where there's both a higher food waste generation and higher levels of food insecurity. And so the question was whether we might target our work in those types of neighborhoods, right, where there's excess as well as need, for thinking about how more of a solidarity economy, food circularity, can be implemented. And so I certainly think that is the case. Like, we have different neighborhoods across the city where mutual aid groups, where there's a strong social fabric and social cohesion in the communities that enable them to have access to rescued food and to get those to neighbors in need. I think, there is not only food waste generation. So, we have to make a distinction between food waste that's generated from retail establishments, from food manufacturers that are edible, potentially edible, it might be surplus, that could feed people, and food waste that's generated from the households, which in general is inedible, right? So it's what's been sitting at the back of your fridge for 3 weeks, right? We're not going to feed anyone that. And so this map does not make a distinction between the surplus versus the edible versus the inedible food. But I think it's certainly worth thinking about how those correlations might look with surplus food, edible food versus inedible food, and see if those provide opportunities for building those tighter, more local linkages within those neighborhoods. It's a great question. Thank you.
Do you know whether Illinois Tech will after parties and events, if it is someone, even students here, or food pantries or anything. I've wondered about that on some game.
Yeah. So the question is, does Illinois Tech have a procedure, a set of policies for donating surplus food after events, whether that is to students or to pantries or other groups in need? So there's not a standard policy. I would love for us to have a standard policy. Currently, this happens in a couple of different ways. So for you students, one way that you can volunteer and get involved is that there is a group on campus called the Food Recovery Network. And they recover food from the dining halls to donate to food pantries. I believe they donated to the St. James Food Pantry, which is a couple blocks up the street. I think after many events, students who hang around can have access to surplus food, right? And that's the way that we deal with a lot of food waste on a very ad hoc basis. Some groups on campus, so for example, at the Institute of Design, like when we have events, we often contract with one of these small compost companies like Urban Canopy, like Block Bins, which I'll say was founded by an IIT alum, to actually collect the food waste that's generated at that event and take it to their facilities for composting. So there are these kind of ad hoc things that are happening in different places, but there's no umbrella policy. And if you were to speak to catering services or dining services, they would say that they're not allowed to give it away after the fact, because it's been out, because it's prepared food. It's been sitting out, and so it just has like a limited shelf life, and there are liability issues with serving food after it's been out for a while.
So this how do you see how
Yeah, no. All right, so let me try to repeat this question. And I'm gonna jump to one of my slides here. So the question was, what's the role of the government in this process, right? So in Chicago, we've not had an organics ban. We've not had any regulations around food waste. And so we've had a number of actors come up to fill that gap, right? So we have a handful of companies like Urban Canopy. I mentioned Block Bins. There's also one called Waste Not, and there might be a couple others who are collecting collecting food scraps from households in order to make compost, to compost that food waste. And they're really serving the folks who have an active interest, right? Who have those values, who are paying a certain amount of money every month because they care about the food waste issue, in order to pay for it, get someone to take it and compost it, do the right thing with it. So I would say, like the city has many priorities, right? And there's so many things for municipal government to try to juggle, that food waste has not been a top priority. And with the introduction of the food scrap drop-off sites, this is actually an expansion of a pilot that was started earlier this year with 6 sites around the city, where they just wanted to test out what this might look like. The University of Illinois Extension had a huge summit back in May, around composting and like what are the ways that we can really drive composting, food waste reduction throughout the city. And so they have a report that should be coming out in the next few weeks, kind of highlighting priorities around food waste. So I think from the government perspective, right, the department here was the Department of Streets and Sanitation. And so they're really the ones who are at the end of the pipe, right? So they deal with the food with the waste after it's generated, right? So they're not the ones who are planning, who are, deciding what industries. And so one of the things that we saw is that, this pilot is oriented towards residents. We don't have a restriction on industrial, commercial, institutional facilities. And so they are another source of food waste that needs to be managed. And so I think from a planning perspective, there's certainly things that need to be done to develop the policies, set the laws, set the regulations for what is the expected behavior by food service providers, by retailers, as well as trying to do something on the programmatic end, like with the implementation of this food scrap drop-off program. So I see this as the beginning of what the city is doing, and there's been a tremendous movement around climate-related policies and climate justice, and so environmental justice and the equity concerns with how waste is generated, where waste is processed is something that I see like the current city administration continuing on from the work of the last administration to make this an important priority.
So one of the things is the neighborhood insecurity. There are 5 neighborhoods that stood out to me as having a higher level of food security than expected. They are Hyde Park and Bronx Park, Weslynne area. And all of them are in neighborhoods where I would expect to have a higher level of city. And it brings to mind Eric Lindbergh's research on heat wave in the 1990s in Chicago, and how much better than otherwise neighborhoods with people that were were connected, looked up. So they were isolated. How much does this program, how much does this food sharing program incorporate, and how much might it potentially benefit from and happen from better forms of social network, social activity?
Yeah. So the question is, again, looking at the geography of the city, and referencing work that has been done showing vulnerability to heat waves and how social cohesion and relationships with community members is one of the is correlated with a lower vulnerability to impacts from heat waves, right? So if you're looking out for your neighbors, you're more likely to know if they're being vulnerable to a heat wave, and so you can bring them to a cooling center, for example. And so similarly, I think in this food insecurity space, that the neighborhoods where there are active mutual aid groups is meant to be part of that social cohesion, to recognize when neighbors might be food insecure, when they, might not have enough to eat. And so it is a lot about relationship building, and maintaining the relationships, right? And I think, there's an element of age in here, right? So when we think about our elderly population, they might not be on social media or have a smartphone or like have an ability to access information that way, and so what I've heard from the folks in these networks is that like you have to call them, you have to go to their door to check up on them, see how they're doing, and in many places we don't have that social cohesion. And so, what thinking about a food system built on love looks like is one that's loving your neighbor, and looking out for your neighbors, in order to know when someone might be in need and how we can help address those needs. So Dan, I feel like you're asking some really interesting geographic questions, and I would love to follow up with them, because I think it can help us get to like a depth of some analysis that we're kind of not currently doing at this fine level of geographic detail. Question in here. Composting, but I'll answer it as best as I can. So the question is, we are about to enter the winter season here in Chicago, right? And composting requires high temperatures for the organisms to decompose the materials. So backyard composting, right? We can still put our food in the backyard, and that would be affected by temperatures because it's a relatively small pile. Where the composting on the city level is happening is an industrial compost facility. And so I think they are better able to control the temperature and the size of the piles. But I will admit this is a bit over my head in terms of my technical knowledge of composting. And so my sense is that this is something that will continue operating even though it's in the winter because of the industrial scale of the operation. Let me just check anything from online, folks online.
One thing I very briefly point out about is just on the basis of now if you use sort of closed ink, first of all, the process generates something, and secondly, it won't be very productive during winter, but processes during fall and summer will produce.
Yes, I'd also like to add, and I think I have a couple of my students in here, is that earlier this week we visited Green Era, which is the first operational anaerobic digester in the city of Chicago, that started operating earlier this year. And so they are receiving food waste from various entities around the city and using anaerobic digestion to decompose that waste, producing a biogas that is going to be fed back into the natural gas grid, as well as compost matter that will be used for soil. And so within the city, right, we can think about composting, but we also have some other options that are emerging, such as digestion. All right.
So, very interesting when we work is actually we will work with the history of the person who is changing the science of along with the person. So this is the energy the government for in making the use of so you see actually this showing the persons in
Thank you. That's a great question. So the question is around the work that we are doing at the Institute of Design, trying to shift narratives, right? I think it's, let me see what slide I might pull up here. Maybe I'll go to this one. So people's behavior are something that we learn, right? And so the values that we hold are things that we've learned over our lifetimes. And so it's very hard to change mindsets. And one of the ways that we can is through the use of stories and narratives that tell a different way of being. And so this is not something that we expect will change overnight, right? Because mindsets, values are very conservative, right? These are deeply held, and so they're hard to change. But by exposing more alternatives to the dominant narrative, we see cracks in the dominant really coming up and having an opportunity for more people to take hold of them. So just, like as an example, how we talk about climate change, right, is very different than we did 10 years ago. And one of the reasons is that we're seeing more of the impacts of climate change, right? Or whether that is right here in Chicago and how, like the work that you do with flood risk, right? Climate change is a big factor in our increase of flood risk in the city of Chicago, increasing heat waves, loss of crops. So more people are becoming aware of the problems that have been caused by global warming and climate change. It used to be that there was like a very strong political divide, right? That your political stance determined how you viewed climate change. And that still exists to some extent. But more and more people are seeing the impacts. And so that is one way that narratives shift, right? By seeing the disruptions that are caused. The other way is that we talk about it more. Right. And so if we have more people who are talking not only about climate change on this high level, but on the local level and talking about the justice implications of climate change, then that shifts the overall discourse that we're hearing and gets more people in tune to what those problems are. And so, so as I was thinking about what am I going to talk about today in this session, I'm like, I think I want to talk about love. And I know for most research presentations, that's probably not something that you're going to find be the core question at the heart of the research that's being presented. And so this is a conscious decision on my part to shift that narrative, right? And this is the way that I'm doing my part. And I think we as a university that's located on the south side of Chicago needs to talk about how we love our neighbors, how we repair our relationships with the community in Bronzeville to build a stronger region, a stronger neighborhood that's more attractive to the students, that's more attractive to our neighbors. And so I think that stories, visualizations, right? Getting more people to engage in these conversations is the way that we shift those mindsets. Yeah. That's a great question. And I would say that designers don't use a lot of program evaluation. Like we need some program evaluation in here because it's very hard to say, okay, how has a particular story changed a particular number of people's mindsets, right? Like it's, I guess we could use sentiment analysis, right? So there are some digital kind of data tools that we might use to try to measure those shifts, but that has not been kind of like the active area of research and kind of like measuring those impacts. And I think we need to do a better job of it, quite frankly, in the field of design, because coming from a science background, right? Like it's all about analysis and evaluation. And so this is a very different approach. It's okay, like, so how can we combine some of that quantitative with the qualitative work that's being done in this space? And I feel like, we are in the perfect place to do this at Illinois Institute of Technology. And it's, I think, an exciting time for us to be here. And I, would certainly love to explore some of these ideas in collaboration with colleagues in your department. And so I thank you for this opportunity to speak. Yeah. So let me